Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because what you're about to hear will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of this journey. Now, let's get into it. There are moments in life that divide your existence into before and after, moments so profound that they reshape everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world around you. For 23-year-old Gabrielle Thompson, that moment came on a cold Sunday afternoon in November when she stood outside the iron gates of the Whitmore estate with everything she owned stuffed into 4 black trash bags, rain pouring down on her like the heavens themselves were weeping for what was happening. Just hours earlier, she'd been sitting at the mahogany dining table in the main house, the same table where she'd eaten thousands of meals over the past 15 years. Listening to the people who'd raised her calmly explain why she was no longer welcome in their lives. Gerald Whitmore, the man who'd adopted her when she was 8 years old after her parents died in a terrible car accident, sat at the head of that table with his fingers steepled like he was conducting a business meeting rather than destroying a young woman's world. His wife, Patricia, dabbed at invisible tears with a silk napkin, while their biological daughter, Candace, scrolled through her phone with barely concealed smugness. The words Gerald spoke were clinical, businesslike, stripped of any emotional weight. Candace was getting married in 3 months to the son of a prominent family, and they needed the guest house where Gabrielle had been living for the elaborate wedding preparations and eventual use by the newlyweds. He talked about square footage and property value and the importance of family taking priority, and Gabrielle sat there feeling like her chest was caving in, realizing that after 15 years, she still wasn't considered family at all. She was an inconvenience, a charity case whose usefulness had expired, someone they could discard as easily as outdated furniture when she no longer served their purposes. The truly heartbreaking part wasn't just the eviction itself, but the accumulated weight of 15 years of subtle rejections, microaggressions, and constant reminders that she would never truly belong. Gabrielle had been 8 years old when social services placed her with the Whitmores, a scared little girl still having nightmares about the accident that took her parents, desperately hoping that this beautiful mansion and these well-dressed people might become the family she'd lost. But from the very beginning, there were differences she couldn't ignore. How Patricia would introduce Candace as my daughter, but Gabrielle as the girl we're helping. How birthday parties for Candace involved pony rides and elaborate themes while Gabrielle got a store-bought cake and a card signed by the household staff. How Candace's achievements were celebrated with family dinners at expensive restaurants, while Gabrielle's honor roll certificates earned a distracted, "That's nice, dear," before Patricia returned to her phone. The microaggressions were everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life like threads in a tapestry of exclusion. Being asked to eat in the kitchen when the Whitmores had certain guests over, being reminded constantly of how much money they'd invested in her education and upbringing, being told she should be grateful whenever she expressed any need or desire of her own. Gabrielle learned to make herself small, to not ask for too much, to swallow her hurt and disappointment because she was terrified that if she complained, they might send her back into the system. She'd convinced herself that some family, even a family that treated her as lesser, was better than no family at all. But now, standing in that dining room listening to Gerald explain her eviction with the emotional investment of someone canceling a subscription service, Gabrielle realized she'd been lying to herself for 15 years. The 48 hours they gave her to pack up and leave were a blur of pain, anger, and desperate phone calls. Gabrielle's best friend Tanisha, who'd been her rock since they met in community college, wanted to help, but lived in a tiny studio apartment that barely fit one person, let alone 2. Other friends offered couches for a few nights, but Gabrielle knew that wasn't a real solution, just a delay of the inevitable homelessness looming before her. She spent those 2 days in the guest house that had been her sanctuary, packing up her modest belongings and remembering all the moments that had led to this point. The time Patricia told her she couldn't attend Candace's Sweet 16 because it's really just for family. The Christmas mornings where Candace's pile of gifts dwarfed Gabrielle's modest offerings. The family vacations to Martha's Vineyard and Aspen that somehow never had room for her. The college fund that existed for Candace but not for her because you can get scholarships based on your circumstances. Gabrielle had worked 3 jobs to put herself through community college, studying art and business while cleaning houses, waiting tables, and doing freelance graphic design work, all while living in the guest house and being reminded constantly that she should be thankful for the free rent. She'd never asked them for tuition money or spending cash, had made her own way through sheer determination and exhausting work, but none of that mattered now. To the Whitmores, she was still just the orphan girl they'd taken in out of some combination of social obligation and the desire to look charitable in their wealthy social circles, and now that the cost of keeping her around outweighed the benefit to their image, she was disposable. When the morning of her eviction arrived, Gabrielle had hoped for some last-minute reprieve, some acknowledgement of the years they'd shared, maybe even an apology for the cruelty of their decision. Instead, she got efficiency. Gerald sent his security chief, an older gentleman named Raymond who'd always been kind to Gabrielle, to make sure she left on time. Raymond looked miserable as he helped her carry her bags to the front gate, whispering apologies she knew weren't his to give, explaining that he'd lose his job if he let her stay even 1 extra hour. The November rain started falling just as Raymond closed the gate behind her, leaving Gabrielle standing on the street side with her 4 trash bags, looking back at the only home she'd known for 15 years. And that's when she saw them, Gerald, Patricia, and Candace, standing at the second-floor window, watching her with expressions ranging from indifference to satisfaction, making absolutely certain she actually left. No one waved goodbye. No one looked even slightly troubled by the sight of a young woman they'd raised standing in the rain with trash bags full of her life. Patricia said something that made Candace laugh, and then they turned away from the window, returning to their comfortable lives without a second thought for the girl they'd thrown away. Gabrielle felt something break inside her chest in that moment, some last remaining hope that maybe they'd cared about her even a little bit, that maybe she'd mattered to them at all. The rain soaked through her jacket as she stood there, trying to figure out where to go and what to do, feeling more alone than she'd felt since the night her real parents died. But then, cutting through the sound of rain and her own ragged breathing, came another sound, the distinctive whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors slicing through the heavy air. Gabrielle looked up, confused, watching as a sleek black helicopter descended from the gray sky like something out of a movie, its spotlight cutting through the gloom as it approached the Whitmore estate's expansive front lawn. This wasn't normal. The Whitmores didn't have a helicopter, and their wealthy neighborhood wasn't exactly accustomed to aircraft landings on random Sunday afternoons. The helicopter touched down with surprising grace about 50 yards from where Gabrielle stood at the gate, its rotors creating a windstorm that whipped her wet hair around her face and sent leaves swirling in frantic circles. She could see movement in the main house now, the Whitmores rushing to the windows and then toward their front door, clearly as bewildered as she was about who would be landing on their property. The helicopter door opened and a man stepped out. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. Even from a distance, even in the rain, Gabrielle recognized him instantly, and her heart stopped. It was Antonio Blake, and he was walking straight toward her with purpose in every stride. Antonio Blake wasn't just any man. He was one of the most successful music producers in the country, owner of 3 major recording studios, and the creative force behind dozens of chart-topping albums by some of the biggest names in the industry. But more importantly, at least to Gabrielle, he was the man she'd been secretly dating for the past 4 months. The man who'd walked into her life at a charity event where she'd been volunteering and somehow seen past all her defenses to the real person underneath. They'd met at a fundraiser for foster youth where Gabrielle had been helping coordinate activities for the kids while most of the wealthy attendees took selfies and sipped champagne, and Antonio had been the only other person who seemed genuinely interested in talking to the children rather than being photographed with them. They'd started talking, discovered a connection that felt almost electric, and before the night was over, he'd asked for her number. Their relationship had unfolded slowly, carefully, with Gabrielle almost unable to believe that someone like Antonio, successful and kind and genuinely interested in who she was, could want to be with someone like her. She'd kept it secret from the Whitmores because she knew they'd either try to use the connection for their own social climbing purposes or find some way to ruin it, and because a small part of her was terrified that once Antonio saw how she really lived, how she was treated, he'd realize she wasn't worth his time. He'd been in London for the past week on business, and Gabrielle hadn't told him about the eviction, hadn't wanted to burden him or seem like she was asking for rescue. But Tanisha, bless her heart, had called him the moment she found out what was happening. And now, here he was, stepping through that gate like an avenging angel in expensive Italian leather shoes. "Baby, I'm so sorry I'm late," Antonio said as he reached Gabrielle, his deep voice cutting through the rain and the shock that had frozen her in place. He pulled her into his arms without hesitation, seemingly unconcerned about his expensive suit getting soaked, and pressed a kiss to her forehead that felt like coming home. Traffic from the airport was absolutely insane, and then I had to arrange the helicopter, and I got here as fast as I could. Gabrielle was still processing his presence, still trying to understand how this was happening, when she heard the commotion behind them. The Whitmores had emerged from their front door, hurrying down the pathway toward the gate with expressions of confusion and curiosity. Patricia was already smiling that fake society smile she used for important people, clearly trying to figure out who this man in the helicopter was and why he was at her gate. "Who is this?" Patricia called out, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Is there something we can help you with?" Antonio turned to face them, keeping one arm around Gabrielle's shoulders, and the smile he gave the Whitmores was polite but cold. "Antonio Blake," he introduced himself, extending his free hand to Gerald, who shook it with the enthusiasm of someone trying to assess a business opportunity. "I'm Gabrielle's boyfriend. I understand there's been some confusion here today." The next several minutes were almost surreal, as Gabrielle watched Antonio systematically dismantle every assumption the Whitmores had made about her and her worth. He explained who he was, what he did, dropping just enough names and credentials to make it clear he wasn't someone they could intimidate or dismiss, and described how he and Gabrielle had met and fallen in love over the past several months. Patricia's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to shock to a kind of calculating interest that made Gabrielle's stomach turn. Candace had Googled Antonio on her phone and was whispering urgently to her mother about his net worth and industry connections, and suddenly the Whitmores were falling over themselves to be gracious. "Well, we didn't know Gabrielle was seeing anyone," Patricia gushed, her entire demeanor shifting from the cold dismissal of hours earlier to something approaching warmth. "She never mentioned it. If we'd known, perhaps we could have worked out a different arrangement about the guest house situation." Antonio's smile never wavered, but Gabrielle could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from pavement in summer. "That's interesting," he said, his voice pleasant but with an edge that could cut glass, "because I was under the impression that you were putting her out on the street with 48 hours' notice because she wasn't really family. That's what Gabrielle told me, and that's what her friend Tanisha confirmed when she called me in London yesterday. Was there some miscommunication?" Gerald cleared his throat, already backpedaling, his businessman instincts recognizing both a threat and an opportunity. "Now, let's not be hasty here," he said, shooting a look at Gabrielle that was probably meant to be conciliatory, but came across as pleading. "This was all just about timing and Candace's wedding plans. We certainly didn't mean for Gabrielle to feel unwelcome. She's been part of our household for 15 years. Perhaps we can discuss this inside, out of the rain? I'm sure we can reach some understanding." But Antonio wasn't having it, and what he said next made Gabrielle's heart soar even as it clearly made the Whitmores' hearts sink. "You know what's interesting about modern technology?" Antonio asked conversationally, as if he was discussing the weather rather than dropping a bomb. "Security cameras, doorbell cameras, even baby monitors, they're all recording all the time, and people forget that. They forget that conversations held in common areas, They're all being captured. My team has spent the last 18 hours reviewing quite a bit of footage from various sources, and I have to say the way you've treated Gabrielle over the years is absolutely fascinating. Documenting it all, I mean. The color drained from Patricia's face, and Gerald's expression went from ingratiating to alarmed in half a second. Antonio continued, his voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Now, I have some very good friends who work in media, investigative journalism, that sort of thing. They'd be very interested in a story about a wealthy family who adopted a tragic orphan for the optics, but treated her like hired help for 15 years before discarding her when she was no longer useful. That's the kind of human interest story that really resonates with people, especially when there's video evidence. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but absolutely clear. Antonio could destroy their reputation, could expose them to public scrutiny and shame, could turn them from respectable pillars of the community into cautionary tales about the cruelty of the wealthy elite. Gabrielle watched the calculation happening behind Gerald's eyes, watched Patricia's mouth open and close like a fish gasping for air, watched Candace for the first time look genuinely worried rather than smugly superior. It would have been easy for Antonio to press that advantage, to make demands or extract revenge, but instead he did something that surprised everyone, including Gabrielle. "But here's the thing," Antonio said, his arm still protective around Gabrielle's shoulders. "Gabrielle didn't want me to come here and make threats or cause problems. She's too kind for that, too forgiving, even after everything you've put her through. She just wanted to leave quietly and start her new life because, unlike some people, she doesn't need to tear others down to build herself up. So here's what's going to happen. My people are going to load her belongings into the helicopter, and we're going to leave. And you're going to go back to your lives and forget she ever existed, which honestly seems to be what you wanted anyway." He paused, letting that sink in, before adding, "But if I ever hear that you're speaking negatively about her, if you try to interfere in her life in any way, if you so much as mention her name in public without the utmost respect, then all that footage finds its way to every media outlet in the state. We clear?" Gerald nodded stiffly, his face red with humiliation and anger, while Patricia had actual tears streaming down her face now, real ones this time, born of fear for their social standing, rather than any genuine emotion for Gabriel. Candace wouldn't even make eye contact, staring at her phone like it might offer some escape from this mortifying situation. Raymond, who'd been watching from a respectful distance, was trying and failing to hide a smile as he helped Antonio's team, two efficient people who'd emerged from the helicopter with military precision, load Gabrielle's trash bags into the aircraft. The whole operation took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours as Gabrielle stood there in the rain, Antonio's arm around her, watching the only family she'd known for 15 years realize that they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. They'd assumed she was nobody, nothing, a girl with no resources or connections who they could discard without consequences, and that assumption had just blown up spectacularly in their faces. When the last bag was loaded, Antonio turned to Gabrielle, his expression softening from the cold businessman mask he'd worn for the Whitmores. "Ready to go home, baby?" he asked gently, and Gabrielle realized he wasn't asking if she was ready to go to his house or some hotel. He was asking if she was ready to leave this chapter of her life behind forever. She looked back at the mansion one last time, at the people who'd raised her without ever truly loving her, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger anymore, or hurt, or even disappointment. It was just peace, the kind that comes from finally accepting a painful truth and deciding to move forward anyway. The helicopter ride was surreal, lifting up and away from the Whitmore estate as Gabrielle watched it shrink beneath them until it was just another mansion in a neighborhood full of them, insignificant and small. Antonio held her hand the entire time, not saying much, just being present while she processed everything that had happened. But once they were in the air and the adrenaline started to fade, he began to tell her things she hadn't known, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized he'd been putting together since Tanisha's phone call. He'd been planning something for her, he explained, a surprise for her upcoming birthday in 2 weeks. He'd arranged for her artwork, the paintings she created in her spare time, and had shown him so nervously on their third date to be featured in a prestigious gallery show in New York. Antonio had connections in the art world through his music industry work, and he'd shown her portfolio to several gallery owners and private collectors who'd been blown away by her talent. 3 pieces had already sold to private collectors for significant amounts, and the gallery show would be her official launch as a professional artist, something she'd dreamed about but never thought possible. "I believe in you," Antonio said simply, his dark eyes intense as he looked at her in the helicopter's dim interior. "I've believed in you since that first night when I watched you with those foster kids, the way you really listened to them, really cared about them. Not because it benefited you, but because you understood what they were going through. You've got this incredible talent, this amazing heart, and you've been surrounded by people who couldn't see it or didn't want to see it because acknowledging your worth meant acknowledging their own cruelty." As the helicopter flew through the darkening sky, Antonio shared his own story, details he'd mentioned before but never in depth, about growing up in foster care himself in Detroit, about aging out of the system at 18 with nothing but a keyboard he'd bought at a pawn shop and an impossible dream. He'd slept in his car, worked overnight shifts at a gas station, and spent every spare moment creating music, teaching himself production, networking with anyone who would give him 5 minutes of their time. It had taken years of rejection, of doors slammed in his face, of people telling him he'd never make it, before he got his first real break producing a track for a local artist that unexpectedly went viral. From there, he'd built his empire one relationship at a time, never forgetting where he came from, always looking for ways to help other people who'd been counted out by society. That's why he'd been at the foster youth fundraiser where he met Gabrielle, why he donated millions to organizations supporting kids in the system, why her story had resonated with him so deeply. "When I saw you that night," Antonio said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of Gabrielle's hand, "I saw myself, or at least who I used to be, someone with so much to offer but surrounded by people who couldn't see it. And I knew I wanted to know you, to be part of your life if you'd let me, because people like us, we understand things that others don't. We know what it's like to have to prove our worth every single day, to feel like we're only as valuable as what we can offer other people." He'd fallen in love with her gradually, he explained, through long conversations about art and music and dreams, through watching her navigate the world with grace, despite carrying so much hurt, through witnessing her kindness even toward people who didn't deserve it. The helicopter landed at a private airfield where a car was waiting to take them to Antonio's home, a beautiful converted warehouse in the city's arts district that Gabrielle had visited several times before, but suddenly felt different, like she was seeing it with new eyes. It was more than just expensive. It was thoughtful, filled with art from emerging artists Antonio supported, with comfortable spaces designed for creativity and conversation, rather than showing off wealth. Over the next several hours, as they sat together in his living room with the city lights twinkling through floor-to-ceiling windows, Antonio laid out a vision for their future that took Gabrielle's breath away. He wasn't just offering her a place to stay, he was offering her partnership, the chance to build something meaningful together. He wanted her to have her own studio space in one of his buildings, wanted to connect her with other artists and galleries, wanted to support her education if she decided to pursue an advanced degree in fine arts. But more than that, he wanted her to know she was valued for who she was, not for what she could provide or how she could benefit someone else's image. "You don't owe me anything," Antonio said firmly when Gabrielle tried to talk about paying him back or earning her keep. "This isn't charity, and you're not a project. This is me caring about someone I love and wanting to see them thrive. You've been surviving for so long, Gabrielle. I just want to give you the chance to actually live." He told her about his plans to start a foundation supporting aged-out foster youth, providing them with resources for housing, education, and career development, and asked if she'd consider being involved, using her story and her art to help others who'd walked similar paths. 6 months later, Gabrielle stood in that New York gallery surrounded by her artwork, pieces that explored themes of abandonment, belonging, resilience, and hope, with Antonio by her side and a crowd of collectors, critics, and art enthusiasts filling the space. The show was a massive success, with nearly every piece selling and critics praising her raw emotional honesty and technical skill. But more meaningful than the sales or the reviews were the people who came. Tanisha, who'd driven up from home with her family to celebrate her best friend's triumph, Raymond, the former security guard who'd quit working for the Whitmores and now worked on Antonio's security team, and dozens of young people from foster care backgrounds who'd heard about Gabrielle's story and came to see what was possible when someone refused to let their past define their future. The Whitmores had sent flowers, a lavish arrangement that arrived with a card expressing pride in our Gabrielle and congratulations on her success, and Gabrielle had donated them to a children's hospital without a second thought because she didn't need their validation anymore. She'd started her foundation, partnering with Antonio to create programming that provided not just financial support but mentorship and community for young people transitioning out of foster care, and already they were making a difference in dozens of lives. Standing there in that gallery, with Antonio's hand in hers, and her artwork on the walls, and proof all around her that she'd built something real and valuable with her own talents and determination, Gabrielle realized that the Whitmores had actually given her a gift when they threw her out, though certainly not the one they intended. They'd forced her to stop making herself small, to stop accepting crumbs of affection from people who would never truly value her, to stop believing the lie that she should be grateful just to be tolerated. And in doing so, they'd cleared the path for her to find people who would love her, not despite who she was, but because of it. To build a life that was authentically hers, rather than an approximation of what others thought she should be. She'd learned that family wasn't about blood or legal papers or who raised you in their house. It was about who showed up when you were standing in the rain with trash bags, who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself, who saw your worth even when the whole world seemed determined to convince you that you had none. The Whitmores had taught her what family wasn't, and Antonio, Tanisha, Raymond, and all the others who'd embraced her had shown her what it could be. And that, Gabrielle thought as she looked around that gallery at her new life taking shape, was worth every moment of pain it had taken to get there. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time someone showed up for you when you needed them most, or share your own story of overcoming rejection to find where you truly belong. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that remind us all that our worth is never determined by people who can't see our value. Remember, sometimes the people who reject you are actually doing you a favor by getting out of your way so the right people can find you. Keep pushing forward, keep believing in yourself, and never let anyone convince you that you're less than extraordinary. I'll see you in the next video.